My name is Akylina Printziou. I am a translator and independent scholar. And today I will talk about visibility, agency, and market forces in Greek and English translations of Japanese literature. Japanese literature has been gaining more and more popularity in recent decades as more authors and a wider variety of texts are being translated and shared with the world. In the English-speaking world in particular, literary translations from the Japanese have emerged since the late 19th century, when mostly scholars and embassy emissaries that had lived in the country had undertaken the arduous task of translating some texts as a means of furthering the transferring of cultures. Despite those very early translation attempts, according to Fowler, Japanese literature, and particularly modern fiction, began to be actively translated into English in the 1950s, with well-known names such as Donald Keene, Edward Seidensticker, and Ivan Morris, translating the works of Dazai Osamu, Kawabata Yasunari, Tanizaki Junichiro, Mishima Yukio, and many others. The covers of the editions that appeared during this period, as Yoshio aptly observes, seem to reproduce a stereotypical image of Japan, including, as you can see, geishas, torii-gates, samurai, and in general promoting a rather more exotic side of Japan. Given the time period, right in the aftermath of World War II, these covers likely aimed to erase the pre-war memory of Imperial Japan and bring forth a new image that was exotic, aesthetic, and feminine. Another, perhaps larger wave of Japanese literary translations came about in the 1990s, which was spurred by none other than Murakami Haruki. Although not instantly famous and popular, Murakami gradually became widely read, thus sparking renewed interest in Japanese authors and literary culture, and this time including female authors as well, like Yoshimoto Banana and Kirino Natsu. A large portion of the popularity that Japanese literature started to gain is, of course, owed to its translators, the often overlooked proponents of Japanese culture who work diligently to bridge this gap between the two cultures as much as possible. I'm sure you all recognize, if not all, then at least a lot of them, a lot of these names here. Of course, widely recognized translations aren't unique to the Anglophone sphere of translated literature, but undoubtedly, the Anglophone literary translation often transcends its national intended audience and becomes a global issue. English translations of Japanese literature are readily available in many countries and parts of the world, where English isn't even a national language, and a large amount of people come into contact with Japanese literature through them and their English words on the page. So, what happens when Japanese literature is translated into less widely spoken languages, such as Greek? According to Heilbron, in Greece, the proportion of translated books published is more than 40%, with a large majority of translations being from English. The very first Japan-related translation I could find goes as far back as 1905 in the Athenian periodical Panathenea, where a very rough translation of the Greco-Irish author Lafcadio Hearn's retellings of Japanese tales was introduced to Greece for the first time. His book, Kwaidan, was first translated and published in Greek in 1922. Those very first translations in those precarious years of the early 20th century didn't even have proper translator credits, providing merely the supposed translator's initials. However, one could argue that Lafcadio Hearn, although deemed the national poet of Japan, wrote in English and not in Japanese. The earliest Greek translation of a Japanese language work I could identify was Kawabata's Snow Country, which was translated for the first time into Greek in 1968, probably spurred by the author's win of the Nobel Prize in Literature that year. In the following years, some other classic works followed, such as Akutagawa's Rashomon in 1970 and Mishima's After the Banquet in 1986. As you can see, the Greek translations of that period followed exactly the pattern seen earlier of the English translations, whereby the covers seemed to rely on stereotypical images that exoticize Japan and depict it in a very specific manner that sets it apart from anything Western. This could very likely be attributed to the fact that those translations were never done through the original Japanese text, but rather through English and in certain cases through French. Intermediary translation, that is, translation of a text through a third intermediary language, was a practice that happened quite often back then, and especially in Europe. Both Heilbron and Kittel and Frank note that intermediary translation was mostly a thing of the past, a practice that still happens today, but not as frequently. However, for a minor language like Greek, the practice of intermediary translation went on through the entirety of this period and largely continues until today. Ivaska, Pieta, and Gambier have claimed that indirect translation often raises negative thoughts, as it's often seen as inferior, lacking textual nuances, and reproducing possible errors or misunderstandings the intermediary language text might have contained. Specifically in Greek, a very common issue is the mispronunciation or misspelling of names or places. For example, the pronunciation of the syllable wa is pronounced very frequently as va, so Kawabata becomes Kawabata, Akutagawa becomes Akutagawa, and of course, the famous motorcycle brand Kawasaki also becomes Kawasaki. Certain translations from the French tend to place the intonation of the Japanese names at the last syllable, and we have examples such as Komati or Mizue. Another example is Natsume Soseki's Kokoro, which was published for the first time in Greek in 1996. And then another retranslation was published based on English in 2023. Despite the oftentimes elusive translation of the word kokoro, as is evident from the fact that the English translation has kept the word in its original Japanese, both Greek versions translated the title as the heart of things or the sentimental heart of a man, thus planting a certain idea in the readers' heads of what this Japanese word might mean or what the book might allude to. Probably, the translators considered this word as too foreign for the Greek ears and attempted to provide a title more easily understood by the Greek audience. Translation from Western languages may be thought of as quote-unquote easy because it's more familiar. As Europeans, we are constantly surrounded by those languages and their cultures have permeated our everyday lives and even manner of speaking. An Asian language like Japanese is so far away from what we are normally used to. But does the translation of this culture through a familiar language make it more familiar to us, or does it enhance its foreignness, making it seem even further away than it originally is? I would argue for the latter, since in most cases, translating through a third language can feel like crossing a bridge, while also standing on a different bridge. You can't see the original bridge, and you seem to go even further away from it the more you progress. Another issue could be reproducing possible mistranslations or omissions of the English translation. For example, it's widely known that some of Murakami's earlier work was translated with missing parts of the original text to make them more appealing to the English-speaking public or to omit parts that were rendered uninteresting to the Anglophone reader. So what happens when those abridged versions are the ones translated into lesser-known languages like Greek? Indeed, Hard-Boiled Wonderland was translated, Murakami's book was translated using the English version as the original, and it was published in Greek in 1996. Now it is out of print, as most Japanese literature that was translated in the 90s and the early 2000s. As you can see, the Greek translation is almost identical to the English one, not leaving any doubt that this is the version they based the translation on. Interestingly enough, the translations of that time didn't always mention what language the translation was from. The initial translation by Birnbaum is known for having reversed the title of the original, Sekai no Arito ha Bordo Wondarando, to Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, something which the Greek translation has also kept, as there was no way for the translator back then to know that the original Japanese was different. Same goes for some of the content, as Birnbaum notoriously edited, omitted, and altered large portions of the original text he translated. After a quick check with the original, the Greek version follows Birnbaum's version, as was expected, while also making additional changes to the punctuation and words or expressions used in order for the text to flow more naturally in Greek. This begets the question of whose words are exactly translated in this case. Was the Murakami the Greek readers first came into contact with the same Murakami that Japanese readers experienced, or an altered version of Murakami sifted through an Anglophone lens first before being delivered to a Greek audience? Heilbron, expanding on the Swan's world language system, identifies a world system in book translation according to which there is a hierarchical structure among languages. English occupies the most central position in the structure, accounting for more than 60% of translated books worldwide as a source language, a number that has increased significantly since the 1980s when the idea of a world system was first expressed. Japanese occupies a peripheral position, much like Greek. There seems to be a very uneven distribution in this world system in which English clearly dominates. To further this claim, Heilbron continues saying that the communication between peripheral languages, in this case Japanese and Greek, often passes through the center. This means that what is translated from one peripheral language to the other is very much dependent on what has been translated from one peripheral language to a central language first. Although indirect translation has been dominating the Greek literary landscape when it comes to languages like Japanese, there are some, admittedly rare, cases where literature is translated directly from the original. Currently, there are three major translators who work or have worked directly from Japanese to Greek. One of them is Panagiotis Evangelidis, who translated many classic Japanese authors like Tanizaki, Kawabata, Mishima, and the more contemporary Ogawa Yoko. Another translator is Stelios Papalexandropoulos, who is also an academic, a Japanologist, and has translated Abe Kobo, Ueda Akinari, and Dazai Osamu's No Longer Human. Currently, there are three distinct Greek translations of No Longer Human, and they came out all the same year, as you can see, from different publishers and different translators. Only one was translated from the original Japanese. It's interesting how all of the titles of those three play with some iterations of the English title No Longer Human. Although I do agree that it's an excellent title for Ningen Shikaku, it would have been interesting to see what its translation would have been had there not been any influence by the English one. Last, but certainly not least, Maria Argiraki, who has translated some of Murakami Haruki's work into Greek. Unfortunately, she only worked on 3 of his books, so we only have those 3 distinct Murakami translations from Japanese. She also worked on Miyazawa Kenji's Night on the Galactic Railroad. The most recent direct translation from the Japanese was published in 2022, and that was No Longer Human, indicating that those translators aren't currently very active in this field. That, paired with the fact that the majority of their translations have focused on mostly classic works, with the more contemporary examples being Ogawa Yoko and, of course, Murakami, leaves a rather large gap to be filled, as it seems that all 3 translators follow their own personal interests and affinities in literature rather than the current trends. In September 2024, the Japanese embassy in Greece, along with the University of Athens, organized a symposium about Japanese literary translation into Greek, in which they had invited all of those 3 translators I mentioned here. All of them shared a lot of interesting insights, and they all said that they have either selected the words they have translated on their own because they meant something special to them, or the publishers had approached them with specific projects in mind after they had built their reputation as experts and established a specific sort of back catalogue in the kind of literature that they translated. This goes to show that those translators, sometimes along with the publishers, have a lot of agency and the freedom to select what their translations will be, regardless of what the industry is trying to push or popularize. One of the things they had all agreed upon in that symposium was that in order for the translator to take on translating literature from Japan, apart from a solid grasp of the language, they also need to have spent some time living in Japan, becoming acquainted with the culture in a way that books and screens cannot teach you. And while I would agree that having such a close and direct experience with Japan is definitely important, it seems to set an almost impossible bar for future aspiring translators. Greece is one of the very few European countries that doesn't have a Japanese or even Asian language and literature department at university level, so the opportunities a Greek person can have to not only learn the language at such a high level, but also study and live in Japan for an adequate amount of time are very scarce. Besides, this is a requirement that is never asked of translators from other languages, especially from English. Although translators who work directly from Japanese opt for more classic works of literature that reflect their personal taste, the trends of more modern Japanese literature, such as iyashike or healing literature or cat-related books, haven't been absent in Greece. I would like to very briefly showcase some of those publications as well. You can see that the covers of the Greek editions are identical to those of the English ones, and the titles are in most cases a direct translation of the English titles as well. Also, most of those contemporary fiction translations are published relatively close to the English translation. My own interpretation, apart from the cost and probable lack of translators, is also that the English language editions are all over social media now, and users across the globe can see and access them more easily than in previous years, so publishers might want to keep the same covers and titles so that readers can easily recognize the book as something they've also seen on social media. Of course, not all translations and publications remain so similar to their English counterparts. For example, Ogawa Yoko's The Memory Police was translated into Greek by a rather famous translator/novelist of mostly detective and crime fiction, even though some of Ogawa's works were translated directly from Japanese in previous years. Which brings me to the question of maybe one of the reasons why Greek publishers still opt for translation from the English, because they have already established translators from English that they work with, and the public knows and perhaps trusts more. My second example here is The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, written in the 11th century and spanning around 1,000 pages in most of its translations. Given that the language of the original text is nowhere near the Japanese language taught today, and the fact that any translator who undertakes the task of translating it into their language should have a very solid grasp of both the language and culture of the time, this Greek edition came out in December of 2024, being a little over 300 pages long, making it a very, very abridged version. Many scholars have expressed the opinion that one could very well devote their entire life into translating the Tale of Genji, given its magnitude and challenges. Abridged versions of such long classics might be helpful for someone to have a general grasp of what the text is about, but for those who want to experience the text and its complexities, such editions do the text a disservice, in my opinion. The author's intent, much less her words, will never truly reach the readers in this way, since those editions seem more akin to mere summaries of the work rather than a rendition of the work itself. As Lefebvre claimed, translation is not merely a linguistic transfer, but a cultural process. Translators are not just given the task of bringing the words on the page into their target language, but also ensure that the cultural elements also follow across. Lefebvre also pointed out that the translation is in fact rewriting, and this rewriting can reflect a certain ideology and manipulate literature to function in a certain way. Rewriting can also sometimes repress innovation, distort, and contain. In a way, isn't this what happens with intermediary translation as well? The Greek translators, or any translators who use a third language to translate from, follow the English text, which has already undergone a kind of rewriting, according to Lefebvre's definition, and has been interpreted a certain way for a certain audience. Then, the Greek audience receives an even more distorted version of this text. Despite its possible readability, the final product will inevitably differ vastly from the original. However, the act of translation itself has been characterized as a betrayal, and the translator as a traitor, according to the Italian saying traduttore traditore, which literally means translator traitor. If translation is a betrayal anyway, if there is no way for a translator to truly and actually remain faithful to the original, then what does this mean for indirect translations, and which are even further from the original? Is this a double betrayal? And how much further can we go without seriously sacrificing the meaning of the text? Fowler speaks about all those expectations and demands laid upon literary translators, and especially those who work from exotic languages like Japanese. They are burdened with the nearly impossible task of working as linguistic wizards and cultural arbitrators, all while delivering a final product that is both enjoyable, accurate, and accessible, even by readers who have no prior knowledge of Japanese culture. It is a Herculean task indeed, so maybe we should cherish and amplify those translators who do this worldwide and try to find ways to enable aspiring translators from being equipped with the right tools to also achieve this kind of sorcery in their own languages. I would like to conclude with a quote by Murakami Haruki that I believe summarizes this very succinctly. In his essay, To Translate and to be Translated, Murakami says, if a translation can be read smoothly and effortlessly and thus enjoyably, then it does its job as a translation perfectly well. That is my basic stance as the original author, for that is what the stories I conjure and lay out are really about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akylina.